The first thing I smelled that morning was chlorine. The second was fresh-cut grass. Then I saw the sign. Crystal Springs Community Pool. Grand opening today. It stood in the middle of land my grandfather had spent his entire life protecting. If you have ever wondered how a $185 HOA violation can destroy a $24 million neighborhood, this is that story. My name is Ethan Calloway. I raise cattle on a ranch my family has owned for more than a century in Central Texas. My boots spend more time in mud than on sidewalks. My truck is older than most of the houses around me. People see the faded paint and the worn leather seats. They assume they already know everything about me. That assumption ended up costing an entire subdivision more money than anyone thought possible. The morning sun reflected off bright blue water where my cattle pond should have been. Lounge chairs circled the concrete deck. White umbrellas fluttered in the breeze. Music drifted across the pasture from hidden speakers. Children laughed while adults carried colorful drinks around a pool that had never belonged to them. My fence was gone. My survey stakes had disappeared. Even the old oak tree where my father taught me to repair barbed wire now wore a string of decorative lights. I stood there without saying a word. The humid air carried the sharp scent of sunscreen and expensive perfume. Somewhere behind me, one of my Angus cows let out a slow, impatient bellow. She was looking toward the same piece of land where generations of our herd had walked for water. Then a golf cart rolled across the new concrete path. Victoria Hastings stepped out wearing a spotless white tennis outfit that somehow never seemed to collect dust. Her smile looked polished enough for a real estate billboard. She held out an envelope as though she were delivering a welcome gift instead of an insult. "Mr. Calloway." Her voice was smooth enough to fool strangers. "Your property borders our newest community amenity. Congratulations." I opened the envelope. Inside was an invoice. $185. Landscaping violation. According to the HOA, my pasture was ruining the scenic view of their luxury pool. Victoria folded her arms and glanced toward my cattle grazing quietly beyond the remaining fence line. "You really should consider modernizing this ranch." She smiled again. "Our homeowners deserve something prettier to look at." I looked from the invoice to the water, then back to her perfectly confident expression. She expected shouting. She expected threats. She expected another stubborn rancher who would waste years fighting in court while her neighborhood collected property value bonuses every month. Instead, I folded the paper once, slipped it into my shirt pocket, nodded politely. Then I turned around and walked back toward my truck. What Victoria Hastings did not know was that she had not built a swimming pool on abandoned land. She had built it on the most valuable piece of working ranch property in the entire county. She also had no idea that my silence was the most expensive mistake she would ever celebrate. I drove home without looking back at the pool. My truck rattled over the gravel road that my grandfather had laid down one load at a time nearly 50 years earlier. Every bump carried a memory. Every fence post had a story. People who looked at my ranch only saw open pasture and old barns. They did not see 4 generations waking before sunrise. They did not hear the sound of calves calling for their mothers on cold spring mornings. They did not smell fresh hay stacked high before a winter storm. They definitely did not understand why one shallow pond mattered so much. That piece of land had never been just another muddy depression in a field. My great-grandfather dug it by hand with neighbors and borrowed equipment in 1926. Later, my grandfather widened it with a bulldozer after a terrible drought nearly wiped out the family herd. My father added underground drainage and stone reinforcement that kept the banks stable through decades of heavy Texas rain. Every generation left something behind. Every improvement was recorded in a weathered notebook that still sat inside the oak cabinet in my office. That pond supplied water to every pasture on the southern side of the ranch. During dry summers, hundreds of cattle crossed the same worn trail toward it every morning before the sun climbed high enough to bake the grass. The trail had become so familiar that even newborn calves learned it within days. It was as natural as breathing. I parked beside the equipment shed and stepped inside. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with machine oil filled the cool air. My old yellow tractor stood exactly where I had left it the night before. Beside it hung my father's leather gloves. They were cracked with age, but still carried faint traces of saddle soap. Sometimes I could almost hear him laughing whenever a neighbor claimed city people understood ranching better than ranchers. He always said the land never argued. It simply remembered who respected it. I opened the cabinet and ran my hand across dozens of faded survey maps rolled into cardboard tubes. Every one had been copied and preserved long before computers became common. My grandfather trusted paper more than promises. He trusted deeds more than handshakes. Most people thought that made him stubborn. Looking back now, it made him wise. My phone buzzed before I could finish looking through the shelves. My neighbor Hank Mercer was calling. His voice sounded uneasy. He had driven past the new pool earlier that afternoon. He told me moving trucks were already unloading outdoor furniture. Realtors were advertising premium pool view homes before the ribbon-cutting ceremony had even ended. Families were signing purchase contracts because they believed the neighborhood had gained a luxury attraction that would increase property values for years. I thanked him and hung up. Then I walked onto the back porch with a cup of black coffee. The evening breeze carried dust across the pasture. My cattle grazed quietly beneath a glowing orange sky. None of them knew their watering ground had been transformed into a resort. They simply followed the same trail they always had until they reached a temporary fence that forced them to stop. Several cows stood there waiting in complete silence, watching, expecting the path to open again. That sight settled something deep inside me. Victoria believed she had improved empty land. She had actually interrupted a working system that had operated without fail for nearly 100 years. She saw decorative concrete. I saw generations of planning. She saw a neighborhood attraction. I saw the center of a living ranch. And somewhere beneath that sparkling blue water rested documents and rights that neither she nor anyone on her board had bothered to understand. The next morning, the neighborhood looked more like a luxury resort than the edge of a working ranch. Fresh mulch lined the sidewalks. Decorative flags fluttered beside the entrance. The smell of chlorine mixed with fresh paint drifted across my pasture every time the wind changed direction. Luxury sport utility vehicles filled the new parking lot before sunrise. Realtors in crisp polo shirts guided smiling couples toward the clubhouse while talking about exclusive amenities and rising home values. Victoria stood beside the pool greeting every visitor as if she had personally discovered paradise. She noticed me watching from the fence line and waved with the confidence of someone who believed the story was already over. I walked over carrying nothing but my coffee mug. She smiled without missing a beat. Beautiful improvement, is it not? I looked around slowly. The concrete deck covered ground where bluebonnets used to bloom every spring. The new fountain sprayed water into the air where cattle had followed the same trail for decades. Loud music echoed across the pasture and scattered a flock of doves into the morning sky. I finally answered. It certainly is expensive. She laughed as though I had complimented her. Then she handed me another envelope. Inside was a second notice. This time the violation claimed my cattle created unpleasant odors near a premium recreation area. The fine would increase every week until I relocated my herd. I read every word without changing my expression. Victoria folded her sunglasses and pointed toward the grazing pasture. Our residents paid for a luxury lifestyle. They should not have to look at livestock while enjoying the pool. I asked one simple question. Did the cattle move closer to your neighborhood? Or did your neighborhood move closer to the cattle? Her smile tightened for just a second. Then it returned. The board has already made its decision. Around us, several homeowners slowed their conversations to listen. Victoria seemed to enjoy having an audience. She explained that the subdivision planned to expand walking trails through what she called an used open space. She spoke about community beauty. She spoke about modern development. She spoke about transforming outdated ranch land into something everyone could appreciate. She never once used the word ownership. Before I left, she added one final sentence. You should really think about selling before progress leaves you behind. I nodded politely and walked away again. By lunchtime, new advertisements had appeared online. The development proudly featured resort-style, living beside scenic green fields. They carefully cropped every photograph so none of my fences appeared in the background. That afternoon, another surprise arrived. A landscaping company parked along my property line and began planting rows of ornamental trees directly beside the temporary construction fence. Their foreman showed me a work order signed by Victoria. According to the paperwork, the trees would create a natural visual barrier between the elegant community and the neighboring ranch operation. Even the wording carried the same quiet arrogance. My ranch had become something to hide. Hank Mercer drove over just before sunset. He climbed out of his pickup and shook his head while staring toward the pool. He had lived beside my family for more than 40 years. He knew every acre almost as well as I did. She keeps acting like she owns this county. I took another slow sip of coffee. The evening breeze carried the familiar scent of hay across the pasture. My cattle remained gathered near the blocked trail, still waiting, still expecting access to the water that had always been there. I watched them for a long moment before answering. "No," I said quietly. "She only thinks she understands what she built on." The first lawyer I visited listened for less than 10 minutes before leaning back in his chair with a tired sigh. The office smelled like old coffee and dusty paper. Framed certificates covered the walls. He tapped my survey map with a silver pen. Then he pushed it back across the desk. "Ethan, I am not saying you are wrong. I am saying you are going to spend years proving you are right." He explained that the subdivision had already recorded construction permits. Utility connections had been approved. Occupancy certificates were being processed. Hundreds of families had already signed contracts. Every passing day made the situation more complicated. Every new homeowner became another legal interest standing between me and my own land. I thanked him for his time and left without arguing. My next stop was the county planning office. The waiting room buzzed with printers and quiet conversations. I recognized several developers walking through the hallway carrying oversized blueprints. When my turn finally came, the clerk searched my parcel number. She frowned at the monitor. She searched again. Then she looked up at me with an apologetic smile. "According to our current records, the recreational improvement area is fully permitted." I placed one of my grandfather's older survey copies on the counter. She compared it to the digital file on her screen. The property lines did not match. Someone had shifted a boundary just enough to make the pool appear outside my active grazing area. Only a few feet on paper. Enough to change everything. I asked for the archived survey history. She quietly explained that older records had been transferred years ago, and some files were still unavailable after a software conversion. The answer sounded practiced, almost rehearsed. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon heat shimmered above the pavement. My phone rang before I reached the truck. It was Hank. He had just driven past the subdivision entrance. Victoria had installed another large sign welcoming buyers to the newest phase of the community. The brochure now advertised private resort living beside permanently protected green space. I almost laughed at those words. Permanently protected. They had already poured thousands of cubic yards of concrete onto the very ground they claimed to protect. That evening, I drove the perimeter fence one more time. Fresh security cameras had appeared around the pool. Decorative stone walls framed the entrance. Workers planted flowering shrubs where my cattle trail had crossed for generations. Everything looked permanent. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked designed to convince people that nothing could ever change. The following morning, another certified letter arrived. This one demanded that I remove my livestock from the adjoining pasture within 30 days because they negatively affected neighborhood enjoyment. Failure to comply would trigger escalating fines and possible legal action. I folded the notice and placed it beside the others on my kitchen table. For envelopes now sat in a neat stack. Everyone carried the same polished logo across the top. Everyone treated me like the outsider on land my family had owned long before that subdivision existed. Late that afternoon, I climbed into the oldest storage loft in the equipment barn looking for replacement parts for an irrigation pump. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight. The wooden floor creaked beneath every step. Along the back wall sat a row of weathered trunks that had not been opened in years. One belonged to my grandfather. Another had belonged to my great-grandfather. I brushed away a thick layer of dust and rested my hand on the cold brass latch. Something told me to stop looking for pump parts. Something far older than paperwork was waiting inside. The brass latch groaned the moment I lifted it. A cloud of dust drifted through the loft and carried the dry scent of old paper and cedar wood into the air. My grandfather believed that every important document deserved a real box instead of a filing cabinet. He used to joke that computers forgot things faster than people did. Looking down into that trunk, I finally understood why. Neatly stacked inside were leather-bound journals, folded survey maps, receipts older than my father, handwritten letters tied together with faded blue ribbon. Everything had been organized with the same careful precision that defined every fence line on this ranch. I reached for a thick envelope marked in dark ink. South Pasture Water Records. The paper felt stiff. beneath my fingers. Inside rested an original survey dated 1906. A heavy county seal still pressed into the lower corner. My heartbeat slowed as I spread the map across the old workbench. Every creek, every fence, every pond, every easement appeared exactly where my grandfather had always said they belonged. Then I noticed another folded document tucked behind the survey. The title alone made me stop breathing for a second. Permanent Agricultural Water Easement Agreement. It had been recorded more than a century earlier, long before the subdivision existed, long before anyone imagined luxury homes surrounding working ranches. I carried both documents downstairs and placed them under a brighter light. The legal language was surprisingly clear. The shallow pond was never classified as decorative water. It was protected agricultural infrastructure connected to a much larger watershed management system serving the ranch. Any change in its use required approval from state agricultural authorities and the regional water district. Even more important, the easement extended beyond the pond itself. It covered the surrounding access routes used by livestock. I unfolded another survey from the same envelope. Someone had highlighted grazing paths decades ago using bright red pencil. One line ran directly across the exact location where Victoria's new pool deck now stood. The realization settled over me like cool evening rain after a brutal Texas summer. She had not simply built on my property. She had built directly across a protected livestock access corridor that had existed for generations. I walked outside carrying the documents in a waterproof folder. The evening breeze rustled through the live oak trees while the last sunlight reflected off the distant pool. It looked peaceful from where I stood. Families floated on inflatable chairs. Children splashed in the shallow end. Soft music drifted across the water. Nobody there understood they were sitting on top of a legal problem so large it reached far beyond county zoning maps. I drove into town early the next morning and stopped at the regional archives office. An elderly records specialist greeted me with a warm smile. The room smelled of old books and climate-controlled storage. She carefully examined my survey before disappearing into the back room. 20 minutes later, she returned pushing a cart loaded with oversized record books. She compared the county copies with my originals. Then she looked at me over her reading glasses. "Mr. Calloway, these documents appear authentic." She paused while turning another fragile page. "And according to these records, your family trust never transferred the underlying agricultural water rights. They still exist exactly as recorded." I thanked her and quietly gathered every certified copy she offered. Walking back to my truck, I finally smiled for the first time since seeing that pool. Victoria believed she had cornered a tired rancher with an old pickup and muddy boots. She never wondered why my family had managed to keep this ranch intact while developers bought nearly every neighboring property over the last 50 years. She assumed simple clothes meant simple circumstances. She assumed silence meant surrender. She had absolutely no idea that the most valuable thing my family ever owned was never the land itself. It was the legal control over the water flowing beneath it. The strange thing about real power is that it rarely arrives with flashing lights or loud speeches. Most of the time it shows up inside a certified envelope with the correct signatures. I never called Victoria. I never argued with the HOA board. I never posted angry messages online. Instead, I spent 3 quiet days driving between government offices with a folder that had grown thicker than a phone book. The first stop was the Brazos River Authority. A civil engineer studied the original easement for nearly 15 minutes without saying a word. The only sound in the room came from the steady hum of fluorescent lights above us. Finally, he looked at me and slowly removed his reading glasses. "Mr. Calloway, this agricultural access has never been terminated." He flipped another page. "According to state records, it is still active." He stamped every certified copy before handing them back across the desk. My next visit was the Department of Agriculture. The waiting room smelled like fresh coffee and printer toner. Farmers wearing dusty boots filled most of the chairs. Nobody recognized my name. Nobody treated me differently. They simply reviewed the documents exactly as the law required. One supervisor traced the old livestock corridor across the survey with his finger. He quietly nodded. "If that access has been obstructed, we are required to investigate." That single sentence carried more weight than every threat Victoria had mailed to my ranch. From there, I drove to the Environmental Quality Office. An inspector listened carefully while I explained that a protected agricultural water source had been converted into recreational infrastructure without updating the historical land use classification. He asked for copies of every survey, every easement, every archive certification. I gave him everything. He thanked me and promised nothing. That was exactly what I wanted. Honest agencies never promised outcomes before reviewing evidence. 2 mornings later, another certified letter arrived at my ranch. This one was not from the HOA. It confirmed that multiple state departments had opened a formal administrative review regarding protected agricultural access and historical water rights connected to my property. I folded the letter and placed it beside Victoria's growing stack of violation notices. Somehow hers looked much smaller now. Later that afternoon, I drove past the subdivision again. Victoria was giving another tour to potential buyers. She pointed proudly toward the sparkling pool while describing exclusive resort living and premium community amenities. She noticed my truck and smiled with complete confidence. Then she walked over carrying yet another envelope. This time the notice claimed my tractor created unnecessary noise near the recreation area. I accepted the paper with the same calm expression I had worn every other time. She tilted her head and almost sounded disappointed. "You still have not hired a real lawyer." I smiled politely. "Not every problem starts in a courtroom." She laughed softly as if I had just admitted defeat. She believed I was running out of options because she only understood one kind of power. She understood money spent on lawsuits. She understood public arguments. She understood intimidation wrapped inside official-looking letters. She did not understand quiet paperwork moving through state offices one signature at a time. As I drove back toward the ranch, the evening sun reflected off the pool until it looked like polished glass. Families relaxed beneath colorful umbrellas without realizing that several government files bearing the same property description were now traveling through different departments at exactly the same time. Nobody had ordered construction to stop. Nobody had closed the gates. Everything appeared perfectly normal. That was the beauty of patience. The ground beneath their luxury attraction had already started shifting. They simply had not felt it yet. Everything changed on a quiet Tuesday morning. There were no flashing sirens. No dramatic confrontations. Just a line of white government pickup trucks rolling slowly through the subdivision while sprinklers clicked across perfectly trimmed lawns. I was repairing a gate hinge when Hank called. His voice carried the excitement of a man trying not to laugh too early. "You might want to drive into town." By the time I reached the subdivision entrance, the air felt strangely different. The music around the pool had stopped. Families stood together whispering. Several inspectors wearing state identification badges walked carefully around the concrete deck while comparing old survey maps with electronic tablets. One engineer stretched a measuring tape across the walkway where generations of my cattle had crossed the pasture. Another photographed drainage pipes leading into the pool. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. Every note they wrote carried the quiet weight of official authority. Victoria spotted me almost immediately. For the first time since this nightmare began, her smile was gone. She marched toward one of the inspectors holding a thick folder of permits. I watched from across the parking lot as she pointed toward the clubhouse and repeatedly shook her head. The inspector accepted her paperwork with complete professionalism. He reviewed each page. Then he unfolded one certified survey from my family records. His expression never changed. He simply pointed toward the original livestock corridor shown on the map. Victoria stopped talking. A second inspector joined the conversation carrying another binder. Then a third. Within minutes, bright orange notices began appearing on several structures surrounding the pool. Construction review pending. Protected agricultural access under investigation. Environmental compliance review in progress. Homeowners gathered around reading every page. Realtors quietly removed promotional signs from the entrance. One by one, the golf carts disappeared from the sidewalks. By lunchtime, the pool had been closed until further notice. The silence around that sparkling water felt louder than any celebration had only days earlier. Late that afternoon, the real consequences began arriving. The subdivision insurance carrier issued an immediate reservation of coverage while the legal status of the recreational facility remained unresolved. The lending bank financing the newest development phase requested emergency documentation from the HOA board. Contractors who had not yet received final payment started calling Victoria's office demanding answers. Buyers with pending contracts suddenly asked whether the promised luxury amenities would even remain open. Nobody wanted to purchase a home beside an uncertain legal dispute. Property showings slowed almost overnight. I never made a single phone call to any homeowner. I never asked anyone to panic. The paperwork accomplished that by itself. 2 days later, I received another letter from the Department of Agriculture. This one confirmed that historical livestock access remained legally protected until formal review concluded. Temporary access restoration measures would be required if existing routes had been obstructed. I read the letter twice before placing it beside the others. My cattle were still waiting at the blocked trail every morning. They had no idea that the law was quietly clearing a path back to the water they had always known. That evening I drove past the subdivision one more time. Victoria stood alone beside the locked pool, Gate speaking into her telephone. The wind carried the faint smell of chlorine across the pasture again. Only now it mixed with fresh rain and the earthy scent of damp soil. The same land she had treated like an empty canvas had begun reminding everyone that it already had a purpose long before concrete ever touched it. And for the first time since this all started, I realized I no longer needed to prove anything. The records were doing the talking for me. The official findings arrived less than 2 weeks later. Thick certified envelopes replaced the cheerful newsletters the HOA used to mail every month. The sound of paper sliding through my mailbox had never meant much before. Now it carried the weight of an entire neighborhood's future. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee while the morning sun stretched across the old pine floor. The first letter confirmed that the agricultural access corridor had been obstructed without the required approvals. The second stated that the recreational facility had been constructed over protected agricultural infrastructure. The third outlined mandatory corrective actions before any recreational use could resume. I read every page slowly. Then I folded them beside my grandfather's original survey. More government vehicles appeared over the following week. Survey crews marked property lines with bright orange flags. Environmental consultants inspected drainage channels. Engineers documented every section of concrete covering the historical livestock route. The pool remained locked behind temporary fencing. Lounge chairs disappeared. Decorative umbrellas were folded and stacked inside the empty clubhouse. The smell of chlorine slowly faded beneath the familiar scent of fresh soil after several days of steady rain. Meanwhile, the financial consequences spread faster than anyone expected. Contractors placed payment demands on unfinished work. Buyers delayed closing dates until the legal questions were resolved. Insurance representatives requested additional documentation before renewing several development policies. The HOA board scheduled emergency meetings almost every evening. Residents gathered inside the clubhouse parking lot speaking in quiet voices instead of celebrating beside the water. Victoria no longer greeted visitors with polished confidence. She walked quickly between meetings carrying thick binders and answering one telephone call after another. Even from across the street, I could see the strain replacing the certainty she once wore so easily. One afternoon, Hank stopped by the ranch carrying a local business newspaper. The front page reported that the subdivision faced millions of dollars in corrective construction costs if regulators required restoration of the protected agricultural corridor. Several pending home sales had already been postponed. Property values across the newest section of the neighborhood had begun slipping because uncertainty frightened buyers faster than almost anything else. Hank looked up from the article and slowly shook his head. All of this started because they wanted a prettier view. I nodded toward the pasture where my cattle grazed quietly beneath the evening sky. No, I answered. It started because they forgot to ask who the land already belonged to. Days later, I finally received a phone call from Victoria herself. Her voice sounded different. The practiced confidence had disappeared. She asked if we could meet to discuss possible solutions. I agreed to meet at the property line the following morning. She arrived without the golf cart, without the polished speech, without another violation notice. We stood facing the locked pool while a cool breeze rippled across the silent water. She admitted the board had relied on updated development maps instead of researching the original agricultural records. She spoke about misunderstandings. She spoke about unexpected complications. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I simply looked toward the old cattle trail still marked by fresh survey flags. The land never changed. I said quietly. Only the paperwork people chose to believe changed. She lowered her eyes and said nothing. For the first time since this began, neither of us needed to argue. The records had already decided the outcome. The only question left was how much it would cost to put everything back where it legally belonged. The restoration agreement became final before the end of summer. It did not happen because anyone lost their temper. It happened because every signature landed exactly where the law required. The HOA accepted full responsibility for restoring the protected agricultural corridor. Environmental crews removed sections of decorative concrete that blocked the historical livestock path. Engineers reshaped the drainage system according to the original survey from 1926. Every step followed approved plans reviewed by the same state water officials and local groundwater conservation district that had opened the investigation. The final bill stretched far beyond what anyone in the neighborhood expected. Corrective construction costs climbed into the millions. Legal expenses continued to grow. Insurance premiums increased. Several board members resigned before the next annual election. Victoria quietly stepped down as president after homeowners demanded new leadership. I never celebrated any of it. Watching people learn expensive lessons is not the same as enjoying their hardship. My grandfather always believed justice should repair what pride damaged. One cool October morning, I stood beside the restored pond before sunrise. A thin layer of mist floated above the water. The smell of damp earth mixed with fresh hay as the first light spread across the pasture. I opened the new ranch gate and stepped aside. The herd did not hesitate. Hundreds of cattle followed the same winding trail their mothers and grandmothers had walked for decades. Their hooves pressed softly into the damp ground. The familiar sounds returned one by one. Water splashing, birds calling from the oak trees, wind brushing through tall grass. The land finally sounded like itself again. The old concrete shell that had once surrounded the recreation area had not disappeared completely. Part of its structure remained after engineers determined it could safely support agricultural use without interfering with the protected corridor. With the proper approvals, we drained the chemicals, scrubbed the tile, and regrade the steep concrete floor so the herd could step down safely. I converted that remaining basin into a managed livestock watering station connected to the original ranch system and fed by our fresh well line. Nothing fancy, no decorative fountains, no colorful umbrellas, just clean water serving the purpose this property had always been meant to serve. The first time the cattle gathered around it, I could not help smiling. Hank pulled up in his pickup just after sunrise. He leaned against the fence for a long moment, watching the herd drink quietly. Then he laughed. That has to be the most expensive cattle trough in Texas. I smiled without taking my eyes off the water. Probably, I answered, but it is finally on the right piece of land. A few weeks later, I drove past the subdivision one last time. Families were outside walking dogs, and children were riding bicycles along the sidewalks. New board members were planting trees near the entrance. Nobody waved violation notices anymore. Nobody talked about luxury amenities. They simply looked like neighbors trying to rebuild trust one day at a time. Victoria happened to be loading boxes into the back of her vehicle. She looked toward the ranch for a brief moment before quietly closing the tailgate. Neither of us said a word. There was nothing left to argue about. As I headed home, the evening sun reflected across the pond where my cattle gathered peacefully at the water's edge, the same place where generations of my family had invested their labor and their faith. People often believe justice arrives with shouting and dramatic courtroom speeches. In my experience, it arrives much more quietly. It lives inside old records that honest people preserve. It waits inside forgotten surveys that patient families refuse to throw away. It survives in land that remembers every promise ever made to it. My grandfather was right all along. The land never argued. It simply remembered who truly belonged there. And in the end, so did the law.